Every criminal record that you could look at, that you would ever see, tells a story. Sometimes it's a very short story, sometimes it's just one entry, sometimes no record at all tells a little story about, oh, maybe things went all right. But then every once in a while, you run into somebody in the population who's got a criminal record that looks something like this. Now, you can't tell what this person's date of birth is based on this here. It's redacted, so you can't identify the person. But you can more or less guess based on the fact that his first crime occurred in 1989 that shows up on his record that probably he was born sometime around 1970. And the first thing that shows up on his record, it shows that in Yellowknife in June of 1989, on a very long day when there was almost 23 hours of sunlight, he was convicted of a failure to appear. Now, looking at this like this, you can see that he was sentenced to 30 days in jail. That's what that 30 days on the right says. This is what he was sentenced for, failure to appear. That means he was supposed to show up in court, but he didn't. And he was sentenced for that on June 2nd. Now, part of the story, if you get to know these criminal records, is you realize, well, if he failed to appear for a criminal case, not this one here where he was convicted, but if he failed to appear for a criminal case, then that means that even if he wasn't sentenced on this date for something, there was something else that made him be charged in the first place for failing to appear. That story isn't complete here. We don't know what it is until you look and see that down here, the case file 88, that's 1988, file number 1362 with the Yellowknife RCMP, included an assault charge. 2 months after pleading guilty for not showing up to court, he was sentenced for assault. So that means that at the start of all this, the police were called in relation to an assault. After the assault, he was told to appear in court. He didn't have a criminal record yet, so he was probably let out on bail, and then he didn't show up to court. He pled guilty for not showing up to court, was sentenced to 30 days, and then during his assault trial or his assault plea, he was sentenced to 3 months as well as probation for 2 years. Now, probation can mean a few things. Probation, if you get to know these records, it might mean we wanted to stop him from contacting the person he assaulted. Might also mean that the judge is trying to do something with that probation order. If you had the probation order in front of you, you could see all the details of it. Again, that's part of the story that isn't fully clear here. But as things move on, this is when you start to see the shape of the person. A third conviction in 1990, in March of that year. This is long after he's gotten out of jail here. He's sentenced for 2 assault charges and gets 3 months again, just like he did before on each of those, one after the other, for a total of 6 months. And then 2 months tacked onto that for assaulting a police officer who showed up in response to that assault call. You see that then it starts to become more regular. After this 8-month sentence is run out, something happened the following summer in 1991. Assault with intent to resist arrest. You can see that this guy consistently has problems with the police. Repeated charges relating to resisting the police. He breached his probation from before, which usually means that this probation order from way back 2 years ago, he probably wasn't supposed to contact someone, and then he did. All this happened in 1991, almost 2 years after he was sentenced for that assault charge back here. After this, just a month later, he's sentenced for another count of failure to comply with the probation order. Sentenced to a fine of $250 and 2 weeks in default if he doesn't pay it. He may or may not have paid that fine. These things aren't really administered very effectively. And driving with more than 80 milligrams of alcohol in his blood. We haven't seen that showing up yet, but now he's drunk driving as well. And more assault charges, which seems to be this guy's specialty. 4 weeks, 6 weeks, more probation, then driving while disqualified. See, what happened was up here, when he when he was found to be driving drunk, he was prohibited from driving for 4 months. This is back before the mandatory minimum was a year. So while he wasn't allowed to be driving, you see that less than 4 months later, he's being sentenced for driving while disqualified. That means he wasn't allowed by law to drive, not just because he didn't have a license, but because a judge ordered him not to, and he did it. So he gets 2 weeks just for driving, and then another 8 weeks for assault again. So a lot of assault, more and more drunk driving, more failing to comply with the rules of the court, more dealings with the police resisting arrest. That's not quite assaulting a police officer. He seems to have calmed down a little, but he's still having trouble with the police. This guy got out of jail somehow, ran away from the police custody. That's pretty intense. You don't see that very often, but he got 3 months consecutive to it. Again, run-ins with the police. More drunk driving, breaking and entering and committing assault. Things are accelerating. Now he's probably getting close to 30 years old. He gets sentenced to 12 months for breaking into somebody's house. This is effectively a home invasion right here. BE, breaking and entering and committing assault. He broke into somebody's house and beat them up. He obstructed a police officer, probably in connection with the same file, though there are two different files here. Notice that these convictions are also happening in different places. Right? For all of these here, he was in Yellowknife. Looks like he wanted a fresh start, so he moved to Alberta. But there he's getting sentenced for things there in his late 20s. Moves on to another community in Alberta. He's probably about 30. He's getting a drunk driving conviction again. More roughing up the police. More drunk driving. More drunk driving. More drunk driving here as well. Failure or refuse to provide sample. That's where the person has been told to blow into a breathalyzer but refuses to because they don't want to, because they know that they're drunk. So the law treats them the same way as if they actually were drunk driving and caught drunk driving. He was sentenced to a year in jail for failure to blow into a breathalyzer. That's because the judge looked at this record, saw the story that it told, saw all these previous convictions for drunk driving, and decided this guy needs a serious message. Prohibition from driving for 4 years. A judge said you cannot legally drive a car for 4 years from now. But look, not long after, here he is driving a car again, getting sentenced to 3 months just for driving a car, not even drunk. Fraud, that's a new one. We haven't seen that from him. He's becoming very, very multi-talented as a criminal here. Assault causing bodily harm. That's not just like the other assaults. Here somebody got really hurt and got 3 months jail time for that. More obstructing a police officer, and now he's back to his very first conviction. I always remember failing to show up to court. Now he's moved back to Yellowknife here. He's drunk driving in Yellowknife, maybe figuring things will change there. And he's moving to another community in the Northwest Territories. So you get through all this and you think, okay, wow, at this point, 2007, he's probably about 37 years old. Looks like he's mended his ways. And it says end of convictions and discharges. You think that's the end of it. Well, it's not. Because the way that police records work is when they come into court, there's the ones that are really consolidated in the system, but the more recent ones have to be printed up on a separate report. These ones weren't already on his full record. They would eventually get there, but these were on a separate sheet. 2009, assault, given 3 months, probation of 3 years, probably to protect the victim. Uttering death threats, 264.1. He gets 8 months jail time. That's more than almost 3 times as much as he was sentenced for the assault itself. Threats are actually treated more severely in the criminal code than simple assault. And just for good measure, of course, he's sentenced for driving while disqualified and given 5 months in jail for that. So this is a total of 16 months in jail, as well as a probation of 3 years tacked onto that. He drives while disqualified again. And you might say, well, how does it happen that he's been sentenced to 16 months here, and here we have him exactly 16 months later committing a crime? He's actually being sentenced here. This is for something that happened before, because if you're sentenced to 16 months, you don't serve the whole thing. Here he is driving while disqualified, and then he's being pursued by the police, and he's not complying with his probation, clearly, if he's being chased by the police while driving illegally. Finally, assaulting a police officer, failure to comply with the rules of being released, and then assaulting a police officer causing bodily harm. That's right. He not only attacked a police officer, he succeeded in causing bodily harm. You'd think that in jail this is actually almost more of an accomplishment for him. He was sentenced to 6 months and 4 days, which was just the time he had spent waiting for being sentenced. He didn't bother going to trial in a case of assaulting a police officer causing bodily harm because police are very good witnesses in court. And that's the whole story of this guy.